Homeless girl wins nothing. What Steve Harvey did next changed her life. Winning is what Family Feud is about. Two families compete, one wins, one loses, and everybody goes home. That is how the game works. That is how it has always worked. But on a Monday afternoon in November 2025, a family lost. They did not just lose, they were shut out. They did not win a single round. They walked off that stage without a dollar to their name, and for most families, that would have been a disappointing afternoon and a funny story to tell at Thanksgiving. But this family was not most families, because the girl standing at the end of their podium, a 16-year-old with braids and borrowed shoes and a smile that she wore like armor, did not have a home to go back to. She was homeless. And when Steve Harvey found out, after the cameras were supposed to stop rolling, after the game was officially over, after the losing family was supposed to walk backstage and disappear, he did something that had never been done in the history of the show. He brought them back. He stopped the next taping. And what he did for that girl over the next hour would prove that sometimes losing the game is the only way to win something that matters. Before we go any further, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel right now. This girl's story is going to stay with you, and what Steve Harvey did when nobody was watching is the most important thing he has ever done. The Porter family from Gary, Indiana, did not look like a family in crisis when they walked onto the Family Feud stage. They had done everything they could to make sure of that. Their matching shirts were white, borrowed from a church donation bin and ironed the night before in the back room of the shelter where three of them were currently living. Their smiles were real but effortful, the kind of smiles that take energy to maintain because the muscles have not had much practice lately. They looked like a family that was trying, and they were. They were trying so hard that the trying itself was an act of courage that nobody in the studio understood. The family captain was a woman named Denise Porter. She was 39 years old, and 6 months ago she had been an administrative assistant at a small manufacturing company in Gary that had closed without warning, laying off its entire staff of 43 people with 2 weeks of severance and a form letter wishing them well. Denise had spent every day since then looking for work, submitting applications to every business within a 30-mile radius that had an opening she was qualified for and several she was not. She had been called back for 4 interviews. None of them had resulted in a job. The severance had run out after the first month. The savings, what little there was, had covered 2 more months of rent. By month 4, Denise and her 2 children were living in a family shelter on the east side of Gary, sleeping in a room with 2 cots and a curtain for a door. Standing next to Denise was her sister, Rhonda, who was 42 and worked as a home health aide. Rhonda had been Denise's lifeline since the layoff, taking the children on weekends so Denise could attend job fairs, lending money she could not afford to lend, and driving Denise to interviews in a car that burned oil and shuddered at red lights. Rhonda was the older sister who had never once said, "I told you so," about anything, because she understood that life did not come with a manual, and that the people who acted like it did had simply been lucky enough to avoid the chapters that would have humbled them. The third member was Denise's son, Marcus, who was 18 and had graduated from high school 4 months earlier. Marcus had been accepted to Indiana University Northwest, but had deferred his enrollment because the family could not afford the deposits, and because he could not bring himself to leave his mother and his sister in a shelter while he went to college. He had taken a job stocking shelves at a grocery store at night, working from 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning, and he gave every paycheck to his mother without being asked. When Denise told him to keep some for himself, Marcus would shake his head and say, "We are a team, Mom. Teams share." Marcus was tired in the way that 18-year-olds should never be tired, the tiredness of a young man who had put his future on hold so his family could have a present. The fourth member was Rhonda's husband, Gene, who was 44 and worked as a warehouse loader. Gene was a big, quiet man who showed love through labor. He had been the one to fill out the Family Feud application, doing it at the kitchen table one night after Rhonda told him that Denise had not smiled in 3 weeks. Gene did not tell anyone he had applied. When the producers called and said the family had been selected, Gene handed the phone to Denise and said, "Something good happened." It was the first time in months that those words had been true. And then there was the fifth member, the one who would change everything. Her name was Zuri Porter. She was 16 years old. She was Denise's daughter and Marcus's younger sister, and she was the reason the Family Feud producers would eventually call this episode the most consequential taping in the show's history. Zuri was a junior at a high school in Gary where she maintained a 3.9 GPA while living in a shelter. Every morning she woke up at 5:30 on her cot, walked to the shelter bathroom that she shared with 11 other families, got ready for school using a mirror she propped against the sink, and caught a city bus at 6:45 that took her on a 40-minute ride to a building where nobody knew she was homeless. Zuri had not told anyone at school, not her teachers, not her friends, not the guidance counselor who had praised her academic performance and encouraged her to start thinking about college applications. Zuri kept the secret the way her mother had taught her to keep it, not out of shame, but out of survival. People treat you different when they know, Denise had told her. And you do not need different right now. You need normal, so we are going to be normal until normal is not pretend anymore. Zuri wore that instruction like a second skin. At school, she was Zuri Porter, honors student, member of the debate team, volunteer at the school library, the girl who always had her homework done and who helped other students with theirs. At the shelter, she was Zuri Porter, the teenager who did her homework on a cot using a book as a desk and a flashlight after the overhead lights were turned off at 9, who folded her school clothes carefully every night so they would not wrinkle, who walked to the public library on Saturdays to use the computers for her assignments, because the shelter's Wi-Fi was unreliable. She was two versions of the same girl, and the effort of maintaining both was costing her something that nobody could see and that she would never have admitted. Zuri was wearing borrowed shoes on the Family Feud stage. They were a half size too big, and she had stuffed tissue paper in the toes to make them fit. Her braids had been done by Rhonda 2 days earlier, tight and neat and beautiful, the kind of braids that an aunt does when she wants her niece to feel special even though the circumstances are not. Zuri stood at the end of the family line with those borrowed shoes and those careful braids, and a smile that she wore not because she was happy, but because she had decided a long time ago that smiling was a form of resistance, that as long as she was smiling, the world could not call her broken. The Porter family was the second family to tape that day, facing off against the Crawford family from Louisville, Kentucky. The Crawfords were a warm, experienced family who had prepared for their appearance with the confidence of people who had been looking forward to it for months. Both families shook hands. Steve Harvey came out and greeted everyone. When he reached Zuri, he bent down slightly and said, "Hey, sweetheart, how old are you?" Zuri said, "16, Mr. Harvey." Steve said, "You ready to play?" And Zuri said, with a smile that used the right muscles but required more effort than a 16-year-old should have to spend on smiling, "I have been ready my whole life." Steve laughed and moved on. He did not know, nobody knew, not yet. The game did not go well for the Porter family. It did not go well at all. The Crawfords were sharp and fast, and they dominated from the first round. Denise tried hard at the podium but gave 2 answers that were not on the board, and the frustration on her face after each miss was the frustration of a woman who was used to things not working out and who had desperately needed this one thing to work. Rhonda gave a solid answer in the second round that briefly gave the family hope, but the Crawfords stole the round with a strong response. Jean contributed a correct answer, but it was low on the board, not enough to shift the momentum. Marcus played with intensity, giving answers quickly and confidently, but the Crawfords were simply better prepared and more experienced, and the gap on the scoreboard widened with each round. Zuri answered one question during the game. Steve asked, "Name something you wish you had more of." Zuri said space. It was on the board, number 5 answer, 7 points. The audience clapped politely. Steve said, "Good answer." And Zuri walked back to her spot at the end of the line, put her hands behind her back, and stood in the borrowed shoes that were a half size too big, and nobody in that studio understood that her answer was not abstract. She was not talking about outer space or personal space or parking spaces. She was talking about the room in the shelter, the cot that was 3 feet from the curtain that separated her family from the next family, the bathroom she shared with 40 people. The physical, literal, desperate need for a space that was hers, a room with a door that closed and a bed that was not a cot, and a wall where she could hang her debate team certificate without worrying that it would be stolen or damaged or lost in the next move. The Porter family lost. They were eliminated in the 4th round without winning a single round. The final score was lopsided, the kind of loss that the show handled gently, with Steve thanking the family, the audience applauding their effort, and the family walking backstage with the polite smiles of people who had hoped for better but were practiced at absorbing disappointment. The Crawfords celebrated their victory and prepared for fast money. The show moved on. That was how it worked. You lost, you left, the next segment began. Nobody came back from a loss on Family Feud. That was not how the game was designed, except something happened backstage that the cameras were not supposed to see. A production assistant who was escorting the Porter family to the exit area later told a reporter what she witnessed. She said that as the family walked down the hallway behind the stage, Denise was holding it together, thanking the staff for the experience and keeping her composure with the practiced control of a woman who had been keeping her composure through far worse. Marcus had his arm around his mother, steady as always. Rhonda and Jean walked behind them, and Zuri was at the back of the group, walking slowly in her borrowed shoes when she stopped. She stopped walking, leaned against the hallway wall, slid down until she was sitting on the concrete floor, put her face in her hands, and started crying. It was not the crying of a teenager who had lost a game. It was the crying of a 16-year-old who had been holding herself together for 6 months, who had maintained a 3.9 GPA from a shelter cot, who had walked into school every day performing a version of normal that required more energy than most adults expended in a week, and who had come to this game show believing, in the private, irrational, desperate way that people in impossible situations believe, that maybe this was the moment when things would finally change. And it had not changed. They had lost, and the losing broke something that had been bending for months. Denise rushed to her daughter. Marcus kneeled down beside her. Rhonda wrapped herself around both of them, and Zuri, between sobs, said something that the production assistant heard clearly and that she would later repeat to Steve Harvey's team word for word. Zuri said, "I just wanted to win so we could get an apartment. I studied the show every night at the library. I watched every episode. I practiced. I just wanted to win so we could go home. But we do not have a home, we do not have anything, and I am so tired of pretending we do." The production assistant's name was Angela. She was 26 years old, and she had worked at Family Feud for 2 years. She had seen hundreds of families come and go. She had escorted dozens of losing families down that same hallway. She had never seen anything like this. She stood in the hallway watching a 16-year-old girl sit on a concrete floor and cry about not having a home, and she made a decision. She walked directly to the studio floor, found the stage manager, and said, "I need to talk to Steve Harvey, right now." The stage manager told her that Steve was about to start the next segment. Angela said, "This cannot wait." The stage manager looked at her face and understood that whatever had happened in that hallway was more important than the taping schedule. He relayed the message. And 3 minutes later, Steve Harvey was standing in the hallway behind his own stage, looking at a 16-year-old girl sitting on the floor in borrowed shoes and hearing the story that would make him stop everything. Steve Harvey kneeled down in front of Zuri Porter in that hallway. He did not ask a production assistant to relay the information. He did not send a message through a producer. He walked into that hallway himself, kneeled on the concrete floor in his television suit, and looked at this girl. "Zuri," Steve said, "tell me." Zuri looked up at him. Her eyes were swollen. Her careful braids, the ones Rhonda had spent 2 hours on, were slightly disheveled from pressing her head against the wall. Her borrowed shoes were splayed out in front of her on the concrete. She looked at Steve Harvey, and the armor she had been wearing, the smile, the composure, the performance of normal was gone. What was left was a 16-year-old girl who was exhausted and scared and who had just been asked, by a man she had watched on television from a shelter cot, to tell him the truth. So she told him. She told him about the layoff, about the shelter, about the cot and the curtain and the bathroom she shared with 40 people, about the bus ride to school every morning and the homework by flashlight every night, about the 3.9 GPA she was maintaining because she had decided that school was the one thing the world could not take from her, about the debate team and the library volunteering and the secret she kept from everyone at school, about the borrowed shoes and the tissue paper in the toes, about watching Family Feud at the library and studying the answers and believing, really believing, that if her family could just win, the $20,000 would be enough for a deposit on an apartment and the beginning of something that was not a cot and a curtain. Steve listened without interrupting. Denise stood behind Zuri with her hand on her daughter's head, crying silently. Marcus was pressed against the wall with his arms folded tight across his chest, his jaw locked, fighting the war between composure and collapse that he had been fighting for 6 months. Rhonda held Jean's hand and did not speak. The hallway was quiet except for Zuri's voice and the distant sounds of the studio preparing for the next segment. When Zuri finished, Steve did not stand up immediately. He stayed on his knees on that concrete floor and looked at this girl, and the expression on his face was something that the production assistant Angela later described as the most human thing she had ever seen. It was not sadness, Angela said. It was not pity. It was recognition, like he was seeing someone he knew, like he was remembering something from his own life that he had never fully put away. Steve stood up. He looked at the production assistant. He looked at the stage manager who had followed him into the hallway, and he said 5 words that had never been said in the history of the show. "Bring them back out." The stage manager hesitated, "Steve, the next family is already in position. We are ready to tape." Steve looked at him and said, with a calm that permitted no negotiation, "Move the schedule. I need the stage. Bring this family back out." The stage manager nodded and walked away. Steve turned to Denise. "Porter, I need your permission to bring your family back onto the stage. I want to tell your daughter's story. I want the audience to hear it. And I want to do something for your family, but only if you say yes." Denise looked at Zuri. Zuri looked at her mother, and the girl who had spent 6 months hiding the truth from every person in her life nodded. "Yes," Zuri said. "I am tired of pretending." 10 minutes later, the Porter family walked back onto the Family Feud stage. The audience was confused. The Crawford family, who had been preparing for their fast money round, was seated in the front row, also confused. The studio lights were on, the cameras were rolling, and Steve Harvey was standing at center stage without a card in his hand because what was about to happen had no card. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve said, "I need to tell you about someone. A few minutes ago, a family lost this game and walked backstage. That happens every day on this show. Families lose. They go home, but this family does not have a home to go to." The audience went still. "This family is living in a shelter. The mother lost her job 6 months ago. The son deferred college to work the night shift so he could give his paychecks to his mother. And the daughter, this young lady right here," Steve gestured towards Zuri, who was standing beside her mother with her chin raised and her borrowed shoes firmly on the ground, "is 16 years old, maintaining a 3.9 GPA, living in a shelter, riding a bus for 40 minutes to get to school, doing her homework by flashlight on a cot. And she has not told a single person at her school because she is afraid they will treat her differently." The audience was weeping. Openly, collectively, without any attempt to contain it, Steve continued. "This girl came on my show because she believed that if her family won $20,000, it would be enough to get an apartment. She studied Family Feud episodes at the public library. She practiced the answers. She came here with everything she had, and she lost. And she sat on the floor of my hallway and cried, and she said something that I am never going to forget. She said, 'I just wanted to win so we could go home.'" Steve's voice broke. He pressed his hand against his chest and took a moment to steady himself. "I have hosted this show for over a decade. I have given away millions of dollars, and I am telling you that the bravest person who has ever stood on this stage is not someone who won. It is this girl, because winning is easy when you have everything. Showing up when you have nothing, that is courage. And Zuri Porter has more courage in her borrowed shoes than most people have in their entire lives." Steve made his announcements, and each one landed on the Porter family like rain on parched ground. His foundation would be covering 6 months of rent for a 2-bedroom apartment for the family, found and furnished and ready for them to move into before the end of the month. He was personally funding Marcus's first year at Indiana University Northwest, including tuition, books, and housing, so Marcus could start the college career he had deferred. He was establishing a scholarship in Zuri's name at her high school, available to students who demonstrated academic excellence while facing housing insecurity. And the show would be connecting Denise with a job placement service that specialized in helping displaced workers find new employment. Zuri stood on the stage and heard all of it. The apartment, Marcus's college, the scholarship, her mother's job help. She heard every word, and she did not cry. She had cried in the hallway. She had cried on the concrete floor in the borrowed shoes. Now she was standing on a stage in front of 200 people who knew her secret, and she was not crying. She was standing, straight, tall, with her chin up and her braids neat and her borrowed shoes planted on the stage floor. And the look on her face was not relief and was not joy and was not gratitude, although all of those things were present somewhere underneath. The look on her face was the look of a girl who had just been told that she did not have to pretend anymore, that the world had seen the real her and had not turned away, that her truth was not something to hide but something to stand in. Denise fell to her knees on the stage. Marcus caught her before she hit the floor, the same way he had been catching his family for 6 months, and he held her while she sobbed with the complete, total release of a woman who had been holding the weight of the world alone and who had just been told that someone else was going to help carry it. Rhonda and Jean wrapped themselves around the family. And Zuri stood in the center of all of them, the youngest, the one who should have been protected by everyone else, and she put her arms around her mother and held her the way mothers are supposed to hold daughters, but daughters sometimes have to hold mothers. And the image of that family on that stage was the most complete and the most heartbreaking and the most beautiful thing anyone in that building had ever seen. The Crawford family was in the front row. Every single one of them was crying. The family captain, a woman named Rita Crawford, stood up and walked to the edge of the stage and said, loud enough for the microphones to capture, "Steve, we do not want the fast money prize. Give it to them." Steve looked at her. Rita, you won that money. Rita shook her head. We won a game. That girl won something bigger. Give her our money. Steve turned to the audience. Did everyone hear that? The audience roared. The Crawfords were on their feet, and they were gesturing toward the Porter family. And the sound in that studio was the sound of 200 people, and one opposing family choosing, in real time, to prioritize a stranger's need over their own victory. Steve Harvey stood in the middle of his stage and looked at everything that was happening around him. The crying, the hugging, the Crawfords surrendering their prize, the audience on its feet. A 16-year-old girl in borrowed shoes being held by the family she had been holding together for months. And he said one sentence. This is what this show is for. The Porter family moved into their apartment 3 weeks after the taping. It was a 2-bedroom unit in a quiet complex in Merrillville, Indiana, close enough to Gary for Zuri to continue attending her high school without changing her bus route. Steve Harvey's team had furnished it completely, and when the family walked in for the first time, every room was ready. There were beds with sheets and pillows. There was a kitchen with dishes and food in the refrigerator. There was a small desk in Zuri's room with a lamp and a shelf for her books. And on the shelf, already placed there by someone on Steve's team who had been paying attention, was a framed copy of Zuri's debate team certificate. Zuri walked into her room, looked at the bed, looked at the desk, looked at the certificate on the shelf, and sat down on the edge of the mattress without speaking. She sat there for almost a minute. Then she took off the borrowed shoes, placed them neatly by the door, and put her bare feet on the carpet. Denise was standing in the doorway. How does it feel? She asked. Zuri looked at her mother and said, The floor does not move, Mama. The floor just stays right here. Denise understood. After 6 months of temporary, of cots that could be reassigned and rooms that could be taken away, a floor that stayed was the most extraordinary thing her daughter had ever felt. Marcus started at Indiana University Northwest the following semester. He moved into the campus housing that Steve's foundation had funded, and on his first night in the dorm, he called his mother and stayed on the phone for 2 hours. He told her about his room, his roommate, the dining hall, the campus library that was open until midnight. And then he said, Mom, I have a desk, a real desk, in my own room. I am sitting at it right now. Denise laughed and cried at the same time and said, Baby, you have earned that desk. You have earned every inch of it. Marcus studied business administration with a focus on nonprofit management, because he had decided that if the world was going to let families like his fall through the cracks, he was going to spend his career building the net that caught them. When the episode aired 8 weeks later, the clip of Steve Harvey bringing the Porter family back onto the stage was viewed over 100 million times in the first 10 days. But the moment that people shared most, the moment that crossed every demographic and every platform and every language barrier was not Steve's speech. It was the Crawfords. It was Rita Crawford standing up in the front row and saying, Give her our money. That single act of generosity from a family that had won fair and square, surrendering their prize for a family they had just met, became one of the most discussed moments in television history. It was covered by every major news outlet. It was referenced in sermons and classrooms and corporate leadership seminars. It became the defining example of what social scientists called spontaneous collective generosity, the phenomenon of a single act of kindness triggering a cascade of giving that extends far beyond the original gesture. The cascade was extraordinary. Within a week of the episode airing, a GoFundMe page that Angela, the production assistant who had brought Zuri's story to Steve, had set up for the Porter family had raised over $700,000. Donations came from every state and from 41 countries. A retired teacher in Japan sent $5,000 with a note that read, For the girl who did homework by flashlight. Education should never require that kind of courage. A group of construction workers in Toronto pooled their weekly overtime pay and sent $1,200 with a note that said, For the mom who never let her kids see her cry, we see you. A 12-year-old in Ohio emptied her piggy bank and sent $37.82 with a handwritten card that said, Dear Zuri, I am in 8th grade and I think you are the bravest person I have ever heard of. Please keep your GPA up. We are all rooting for you. The Crawford family's decision to surrender their prize inspired a national conversation about generosity and the false distinction between winners and losers. Rita Crawford gave one interview after the episode aired. She said, People keep calling us generous. We are not generous. We are just people who saw a child in pain and did the obvious thing. The fact that the obvious thing is being treated as extraordinary tells you something about where we are as a society. It should not be remarkable to give your money to a homeless teenager. It should be expected. The remarkable thing is that it took a game show for anyone to notice she needed it. Zuri's story had a profound impact on the conversation about student homelessness in America. Advocacy organizations used the clip to raise awareness about the estimated 1.5 million students in the United States who experienced homelessness in a given year, many of whom, like Zuri, kept their housing status hidden from schools and peers. A national nonprofit launched a program called Zuri's Desk that provided homeless students with portable desk setups, lamps, and school supplies so they could maintain their academic work regardless of where they were sleeping. The program distributed over 10,000 desk kits in its first year and expanded into 32 states. Steve Harvey featured the Porter family on his talk show 4 months after the episode aired. Zuri walked onto the set wearing new shoes that fit perfectly, and the audience gave her a standing ovation that lasted so long the producers had to signal for it to end. Steve asked her how she was doing, and Zuri answered with the same steady, precise voice that she used on the debate team. "I am doing better, Mr. Harvey. I have a room, I have a desk, I have shoes that are my size, and I stopped pretending at school." Steve asked what had happened when her classmates found out. Zuri said some of them were shocked, some of them felt bad, but most of them just said, "Why did you not tell us? We would have helped." And honestly, I think that is the most important thing I learned from all of this. I spent 6 months assuming that people would think less of me if they knew. And I was wrong. People do not think less of you for struggling. They think more of you for surviving. Steve sat with those words for a long moment. Then he said, "Zuri Porter, you are 16 years old and you just said something that most people do not figure out until they are 60. People do not think less of you for struggling. They think more of you for surviving. I'm going to carry that with me for the rest of my life. And I'm going to make sure that every person who watches this carries it too." Zuri graduated from high school 2 years later with a 4.1 GPA, having added AP courses to her schedule and excelled in every one. She was accepted to 4 universities and chose Indiana University, where Marcus was finishing his junior year. She received a full scholarship funded by contributions from viewers who had been moved by her Family Feud appearance, and who had donated specifically to ensure that Zuri's education would never be derailed by financial instability again. On her first day of college, she unpacked her belongings in a dorm room that was smaller than the apartment Steve had provided, but that felt to Zuri like the largest space she had ever occupied, because it was entirely hers, earned by her own mind and her own effort and her own refusal to stop when stopping would have been so much easier. Marcus had taped a note to her dorm room door before she arrived. It read, "Welcome home. Z, you earned this desk too." Zuri laughed, then cried, then called her mother, who was at her new job as an administrative coordinator at a healthcare company, a position she had secured through the job placement service the show had connected her with, and who answered on the first ring because Denise Porter always answered on the first ring when her children called. "Mama," Zuri said, "I am here." Denise said, "I know, baby. I always knew you would be." Steve Harvey kept a photo in his office from that day in the hallway. Not the stage photo, not the celebration photo. The hallway photo, taken by Angela, the production assistant, on her phone. In it, Steve is kneeling on the concrete floor in his television suit, and Zuri is sitting against the wall in her borrowed shoes, and they are looking at each other. Steve later said it was the most important photo in his office. "That is the moment I understood what this show is really for," he said. "It is not for the people who win. It is for the people who lose and still deserve to be seen." Zuri Porter lost Family Feud. She did not win a single round. She did not take home a single dollar. And she is the most important contestant I have ever had, because she taught me that the game is never the point. The people are the point. They were always the point. Years later, when people asked Zuri about the Family Feud experience, she always said the same thing. "I went on that show to win money so my family could get an apartment. I lost. I did not win anything. And then I won everything, not because of the money or the apartment or the scholarship, because I stopped pretending. I sat on a concrete floor and told the truth, and the truth changed my life, not the game, the truth." She would pause and add with the quiet smile of a young woman who had worn borrowed shoes and armor made of smiling, and who now stood on solid ground in shoes of her own. "If I had won the game, I would have gone home with $20,000 and kept pretending. Losing was the best thing that ever happened to me, because losing is what made Steve Harvey find me, and being found is what I actually needed." If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another one. Leave a comment below and tell us what Zuri's story means to you. Share this video with everyone you know, because somewhere right now there is a 16-year-old doing homework by flashlight on a cot, wearing borrowed shoes, maintaining a GPA that would put most of us to shame, and pretending everything is fine. She needs to know that the truth is not something to hide. It is the door that opens when every other door has closed. We will see you in the next one.